Okay, so this message is entitled, What Does It Mean That Jesus Came into a Roman World? And the gospel and the book of Acts are all taking place in a Roman world. And there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes that may not be immediately evident. And so this is not your typical kind of message that maybe you hear on a Sunday morning. But my hope is that it creates something that enables every other message that you hear on Sunday morning or in Bible study to be that much better. So here we go. This is Warren Buffett, and Warren Buffett is a really great investor. He is currently the third richest guy in the world with $84 billion to his name. Now, what's interesting about him versus other people like, say, Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos, they created companies that then, because of the value of the shares, makes them worth like so much money. But Warren hasn't actually created anything. He's just an investor. So he does buy companies, but he buys portions of companies. And purely through that investing, he has been able to amass the world's third largest fortune. Now, in order for Warren Buffett to do that, he has to really do his homework. And so when he does a buy or a sell, it's at a very precise moment. He is really careful about when those buys and sells happen. And so when we look at how God does things, God has this great precision, this perfect timing in which he does things. And so I think it's possible that Jesus could have come at any number of times. For instance, the Babylonian Empire, they conquered kind of all the known world, and they had a golden era, a unified sort of language. Jesus could have come at that time, or maybe during Alexander the Great and the conquering of the Greeks of everything. He could have come at that time, but he came specifically when Rome was running things. He came at a time without video cameras or YouTube. And so there's something to be said about hearing about someone. Maybe you met someone through the internet somehow, and then when you go to meet them in person, they're somewhat less or something. I mean, I certainly get that from people who meet me after meeting me online. And then they're like, you're not as smart as you seem online. So Jesus came in a time when we couldn't video capture him and throw him up on YouTube. This is currently the most popular YouTube video ever, with 5.4 billion views. And I think it's interesting that he came at a time that he couldn't be photographed, and we have no record of him. This is what I would consider a beautiful neighborhood. I put in this kind of European style neighborhood for my wife, who very much likes Europe. So that when we think about a neighborhood as being beautiful or a great place to live or be, things that come to mind are it's quiet, it doesn't have any crime, there's no people screaming at each other on the street or even in their homes. But even with the flowers being so nice, there's no wretchedness that is going on here. Things are idyllic. We contrast that with a lousy neighborhood. There's crime, it's loud, things are destitute, it's just bad. And so the earth is the bad neighborhood of the universe. And Jesus chose when he was going to come. Now, Rome is a big deal. And I want to give you a few reasons why it's valuable to know more about Rome and the things that went on. The first thing is that Rome at its peak had 1/3 of the world's population, as far as we can estimate. And no offense to Asia and I guess North American Indians, but basically they conquered everything worth conquering. This was the pinnacle of, I guess, the world, the ancient world. And so it lasted for 1,000 years, and you have most everybody living under that rule. So that's pretty fascinating. This is a recreation of the ancient city of Rome made by an archaeologist. It took him 35 years in which to recreate this very accurately with ancient maps. It was the largest city in the world with about 1.2 million people living in it. Now, 400,000 of those were slaves, and the other 800,000 being the rest, the citizens or whatever, free people. Rome was kind of like the Las Vegas of its day in that it had amazing looking buildings, like just so expensive and incredible. And so to walk into Rome was just to blow your mind. They had a culture and values that were exported throughout their empire. And it was just really, really impressive. So anybody that went and visited Rome would then come back and talk about, like, can you believe the Circus Maximus and just how large it is and how many chariots they can have going at one time, that kind of thing. They had indoor plumbing, public toilets, underground sewers, and some of the aqueducts that they built are still being used today in order to feed water to towns and cities. So that's pretty cool. They had a special kind of concrete formula that lasted a really long time. I mean, many of these things are still standing, but it set quickly. And it even allowed them to construct things underwater. It would even set underwater. So that opened up a whole lot of different construction capabilities that other nations simply didn't have. They invented the newspaper by having daily acts written in stone or in metal that would then be read out daily. They invented a welfare system. So grain subsidies, eventually the grain became not just cheap, but it became free. And they had pricing controls in place in order to help the poor. They invented bound books. So everyone else up until that point had used clay tablets or scrolls. And both of those are very unwieldy to try and store. So they said, hey, let's take these bound stacks of pages and put them together. And they called that a codex. And so now we have books. They laid over 80,000 kilometers of roads throughout Southern Europe. And many of those roads are still used today. We've simply, paved over them and continued on. They also had innovations like stone mile markers to tell you how far along you are on that road. And even signs, kind of like exit signs saying, go this way over here for these major headings if you're on your way to wherever. The Roman arch. Certainly they didn't invent it, but they perfected it, and it's still used today in many kinds of architecture. The calendar was instituted by Julius Caesar. It's called the Julian calendar in 46 BC. And so over the course of 2,000 years, we have been using essentially the same calendar. There's only one modification that was made to Caesar's calendar, and that is the adding of a leap day every 4 years. So other than that, they really nailed it. The Roman legal system. So my wife, who's a lawyer, uses Latin phrases still in her work. Like these are things that the Romans invented. The subpoena, doing work for pro bono, signing an affidavit. The concept of being innocent until proven guilty is a Roman idea. Having a constitution of rights. They had one in 450 BC. They invented battlefield medicine and surgery. Augustus is recorded as having the first military medical corps in his army. They had innovations like tourniquets, surgical clamps for arteries to curb blood loss. And what's funny is that the battlefield medicine was so good that soldiers often lived longer than regular citizens. Even though they were facing combat all the time, the doctors were able to keep them healthy and patch them back together better than people just living in the city of Rome. Our marriage ceremony mostly comes from Rome and what they did. The sign of starting it with an engagement ring, specifically a ring. There's other cultures that do the passing of spoons in order to indicate an upcoming marriage. Dressing in white like a Vestal Virgin, wearing a veil, having bridesmaids, and sealing the ceremony with a kiss. These are all Roman ideas. A cake at the end is also a Roman idea. And they've even exceeded us in some areas. I know that divorce is very common in our culture now. But there was a woman recorded in Roman times that had been divorced 22 times and was now getting married for the 23rd time. Now, hopefully that one works out. The Roman wedding was never about marrying for love. It was always marrying for other reasons. And it's funny to read insults of Pompey that people were accusing him of actually loving his wife. Christmas. So the reason that we have Christmas on the 25th is because the Romans had a feast week from December 17th to December 23rd called Saturnalia. And in Saturnalia, they had gift giving and gambling. The Romans were basically against gambling, but it was allowed during Saturnalia. They had weird role reversals, like masters serving slaves. And they thought it was kind of funny, like, hey, look, the master has to go and cook the meal and bring it to me and such. Having greenery about, lights, giving to charity, caroling. Except their caroling was usually drunk and naked as they went house to house singing. So not exactly the same, but basically it was a big deal. It was part of the ingrained culture of the empire. So when the Christians were really moving along kind of in 200 to 300, they decided to just put Christ's birthday right at the end of that on December 25th and just kind of roll all that stuff in. And so now people would have a holiday at the same time that they were used to having a holiday, but for a different reason. Then there's the Pax Romana, which went from 27 BC to 180 AD. So about 20 years before Christ to 150 years after Christ. And it's called the Peace of Rome, and the reason for that is that there's no major wars going on during this period. It's relatively peaceful. The world has never been that peaceful since. And so that 200-year period is a real special period where it was really safe to travel. If you were going to come to a time period and spread a message, being able to cross country boundaries was very easy during this period because you were all part of the same empire and there was peace going on. When there's wars going on, trains get shut down, people aren't able to cross the borders, lines of communication are cut, all that stuff. So this was a good time. But I feel that we've lost the context of the Roman world as we study the New Testament and the way in which it was written. And so my hope is to bring some of this back. And for preparing for today's message, I happened to listen to this podcast that I found called The History of Rome. And it's 2013's best podcast, voted best podcast. And it was created by this guy who was going to school and not even taking history as a major, but just had to take some history courses. And he thought it would be interesting if he kind of walked through the history of Rome. So he decided to make a podcast. He started at 753 BC with the founding of Rome, and he went all the way to the end of the Western Empire, which was 476 AD. So well over 1,000 years there. And so he decided, well, I'll just do 15-minute chunks and kind of work my way through that. Well, what he didn't realize is if he did it weekly, it took him about 5 years in order to do that. And the podcasts went from 15 minutes to 20 minutes to 30 minutes, and some of them are even 40 minutes long. So I listened to this History of Rome podcast by this guy, Mike Duncan, and one of the reasons I listened to it was because I wanted to get that background from which the scriptures are written in. What was the world really like? And why was it that way? And so that's what I hope to share with you. Now, there's a ton of things that I can share with you. So many topics, but I decided to zero in on these 4 because they are less talked about. I could talk about slavery or the army or other things, but these are the 4 things that I think are going to be important. The government and how that was set up, then we'll talk about adoption, then citizenship, and then finally the thing I really want to talk about, which is taxes. So here we go. Let's talk about the government. So Rome began in 753 BC with a king named Romulus, and I won't go into their origin story. what's important here is that Rome had a king, and he was a good king, and they liked him. But then they had 6 other kings, so you have this set of 7 kings. And the last one is in 509 BC, called Lucius Tarquinius. Now, Lucius Tarquinius was really not a great king, and he seized the kingship after assassinating his father-in-law with the help of his wife. So he was kind of next in line, and so he knocked off dear old dad in order to become king. Now, after that, his son Sextus violated a noblewoman, and then she revealed that offense and then promptly committed suicide. So that stirred everybody up, and especially against the Tarquinians. So according to Livy, Brutus was a guy at that time. He was the kind of led this rebellion in order to get rid of Tarquinius. And so they kicked him out. Now, the Roman thoughts, the way they view the world, the worst thing that could possibly happen to you is to not live in the Roman Empire or in Rome, the city itself. So exile was a horrible thing to do to somebody. It was worse than death. So they expelled Lucius Tarquinius, and Brutus made them swear a special oath, and it's called the Oath of Brutus, never to allow another man again to be king in Rome. Okay? So anybody starts looking like they're going to be king, they're going to claim themselves to be king, they start doing power plays in order to become king, you get a free pass on killing them. Okay, so you knock off somebody, you go to court, and they're like, hey, how do you defend yourself? You're like, well, I thought he was going to be becoming king. And they're like, oh, okay. And then everybody just goes away. Okay, the worst thing you could possibly do was try to become a king. The Romans hated kings. That's the big takeaway here. So in order to rule themselves, they appointed 2 consuls annually to rule the city. And so each consul had a veto over the other consul. So even if they weren't together, if you kind of like 2 parents, it's like, hey, you go to one, you ask them something, and then you go to the other parent. If they say no, then it's just not allowed. So Lucius tried to retake his throne, but he was never successful at it. And that is the end of the kings of Rome. And that's the start of the Republic. So the Republic goes on, and it goes on for a while. But one of the things you need to know, this is actually a picture of Julius Caesar from the HBO series Rome. So it goes on for a while, and in 390 BC, the Gauls came and defeated the Romans. They defeated the Romans in the field, and then they marched on Rome, and they just sacked and burnt the whole city. Then they forced the Romans to pay them a hefty ransom of gold. So for the next 350 years, the number one thing that Romans were scared of was a Gaul. Okay, this is Gaul. It kind of covers the territory of France and a little bit of Germany as well, but that's Gaul. And so the scariest thing to a Roman was the long-haired Gaul. Now, we still have those today, and here's a picture of some. They're like the heavy metal guys coming out of the Nordic countries. So they're still scary. And Julius Caesar was this amazing kind of upstart politically. He was a good soldier and general. And so they decided one way to get rid of him was to make him the governor of Gaul. So they sent him over to Gaul, and that was basically to forget about him. But what he did was he actually went and defeated all of Gaul. And so he was really unstoppable at that point. Everybody's like, wow, he killed the scariest possible thing ever. It's literally like killing a dragon. Everybody just thinks like, wow, that guy's amazing. So he went, and then there was a bit of a civil war that was going on because he was rising in power. And so Pompey the Great, it was another great general, and he went up against Caesar, and Caesar beat Pompey the Great. So he beat the Gauls, the scariest thing ever, and he beat Pompey, the best Roman general ever. And so now he is this unstoppable political force, and everybody's in love with him. And basically, you want to be his friend at this point. And so Julius Caesar goes in and gets the Senate to bestow upon him a special privilege. Now, when you have a Senate, if you've ever been in a meeting or in a company that has a lot of bureaucracy, the Senate, I think at this time was at least 300 members of the Senate, if not more. It's hard to get a consensus and things go very slowly. When you have a lot of people in a meeting, it takes forever to get everybody on the same page. So Rome had this very special thing where you could declare somebody to be a dictator. And it was not a negative term, it was a really positive term. So somebody would be chosen, basically, we're being attacked, we're in war, or we have some kind of crisis going on. You will be the dictator for a period of times, like 6 months or until you bow down, sooner than that. But basically, you're assigned dictator and you have all the supreme power for this short period of time, just so we can cut through the bureaucracy and just get things moving. So Julius Caesar got the Senate to declare him dictator, not for 6 months, but for life. And they thought, okay, this will placate him and we can go on to just continuing our republic and everything will be good. Now, Julius Caesar was, like I said, ambitious. He was now dictator for life. And the crowds and other people started shouting at him, king, king, as he would walk by. And there's one famous time when he stopped and he says, no, I'm not king. I'm just Caesar. And that's how Caesar becomes a title like king or like emperor, like I am Caesar, is what they would say afterwards. So the crowds are yelling out for him to become king. And the final straw was in the Roman Senate. There was a spot where the dictator sat, kind of off to the side. And Julius Caesar, decided that chair wasn't good enough. He got a fairly ornate chair that had jewels and stuff embedded in it. And so he went and he had that installed in the Senate for himself to kind of show how, important he was there. Well, you can imagine how everybody else read that. They're like, he just installed a throne in the Senate. Like, he's basically a king in everything but name. So that was the final straw. And on the 15th of March, which is called the Ides of March, Ides meaning halfway point of the month, the Ides of March was a day for settling of debts. So basically, the Roman Senate had to do something about Julius Caesar. If they let it go past the Ides of March, then he would just continue on kind of being this dictator for life and maybe declare himself king. And so so it was the Ides of March, and there was a seer at the time that told him, you will not survive the Ides of March. And he kind of laughed at them, and when he saw that person later as he was going to the Senate on the 15th of March, he was like, hey, ha, look, it's the Ides of March and I'm still here. And the seer responded back, well, it's not over yet. There's still daylight. And then he went to the Senate, and that's when 30 senators all stabbed at him. And then Brutus was the final one in order to stab him. And I'm sure you've all heard the famous term, et tu, Brute. That is actually not recorded anywhere in Roman history. That comes from William Shakespeare many centuries later. But the reason that they killed Julius Caesar was because kings must be killed. Okay, Rome can have no kings. Rome will suffer no kings. So we got to get rid of this Julius Caesar guy. Okay, so that's a little bit about the government setup. Now, obviously you've heard that Rome has emperors. And so the emperors started in 27 BC with Augustus. Technically, it started with Caesar being that kind of dictator for life, and his life didn't last very long. But really everybody kind of starts with the emperors at Augustus. Now, the emperor embodied the state and its policies. So anything that you did against the emperor was also against the state, or anything against the state was also personally against the emperor. They were that tied together. There were kings that existed in the lands around Rome as they were going out and spreading their empire. So one of the things that they had was what was called a client king. So if Rome is coming along with its legions on your border, you have two choices. You can give up or you can fight. Now, to help make that an easier choice, because at the end of the day, Rome doesn't want to lose people. It's easier to just keep your army full than to keep spending it attacking everybody. So one of the things they would do to sweeten the pot was they say, well, you could be a client king. So if you swear loyalty to Roman authority, then we won't fight. We'll let you stay as king of your little area, You will do things our way, more or less, but you get to keep your special privileges and such for your lifetime. He couldn't pass it on to his children, so it wasn't hereditary anymore, but at least for your lifetime, you got to remain king. And that really made most kings go, okay, that's a pretty good deal. And then they would take it. So you have a number of client kings. And so in 40 BC, Syria and basically the Israel area was recently conquered, and Herod was announced king of the Jews by the Roman Senate. So you could be a client king, and it could be announced by the Senate and given that position. And that's how we get Herod the Great, who went and did a bunch of building and stuff, and he was able to bestow it to someone else. So that's why in the Gospels you see a Herod who dies and then another Herod who's later, because it was able to be passed on. Anyway, so the client king was a step below the governor, and I'll explain governors in a bit, but he was a step below the governor, and it was a good position to be in. So with that background, I think the second temptation of Christ makes a lot more sense, where Satan says, hey, listen, I have all this power and everything in the world, and I'll give it to you. All you have to do is be a client king. Just bow your knee to me. Okay? It's a very common thing that a lot of people said yes to, and that's what Jesus resisted. Okay, so let's talk about governors. So a governor was totally responsible for a province. So Rome was made up of, 110 or 130 provinces. The numbers were always changing all the time as they started splitting them and merging them and stuff. But what's important for us is that Judea, or Israel, fell under the province of Syria, the Roman province of Syria. And so that makes sense then when we go and we look at Luke 2, when it says, about that time, Caesar Augustus ordered a census to be taken throughout the empire. This was the first census when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Now I'm going to butcher a bunch of these names because I have not taken a single Latin class, and you'll be able to tell as I go through this. But what is important here is the reason he's mentioning who was governor of Syria, because it seems kind of weird. It's like, isn't this a Galilean story? Is this a Nazarene story? No, it's a story that happens in the province of Syria, and this is the governor at the time. So it's really set in that place. So the governors were usually assigned, they were assigned by the Senate, and they were usually assigned for a period between 12 and 36 months. It was possible to maybe get it for a lifetime, but that's pretty rare. It's generally 12 to 36 months. So basically, you have these governors that are always changing over, and there's a lot of governorships throughout all of the empire. Like if you were governor of the area in Italy, that was way more prestigious than being governor of Syria out in the sticks, basically, right? Out in the desert or something. And in fact, Egypt was so important that only the emperors could be governor of Egypt. That was a special land just under the emperor. So there's so many positions out there, and they're changing every 1 to 3 years. All these governors are vying for different positions. They're trying to move themselves up in rank as they go along. And so we see this playing out at different points within the gospel. So here's just one example from Acts 25. 3 days after Festus arrived in Caesarea to take up his duties as governor, he went up to Jerusalem. So we see a change in governorship right away there. Okay, so as a governor, you had 4 tasks that you were responsible for. The first one's real simple, taxes. You collect the taxes, you send them back to Rome. That one's easy. The second one is that you are the overseer to make sure that that province is being well run. So you are inspecting the books, making sure nobody's cheating, like on the taxes or other things. You're also supervising large-scale building projects. You're also the Supreme Court. You were the law in your province. And so generally, not always, the governor would then travel around from town to town administrating that justice. So that's kind of cool. That court would come to you. Like here we are living on this island. If you want to go to a court case, you have to go to the Sioux. In this case, the court would actually come to you, and then they would hear all the trials in that local area, and then they would kind of move on. And so when the Roman Empire fell, and nobody knew what to do with themselves because they'd been ruled by the Romans for 1,000 years. And they're like, what do I do now? It's like, okay, well, feudalism comes in. You have these medieval knights. So the medieval knights just continued on the same thing of governorship. They would run their fiefdoms by traveling around and hearing court cases, just like the Romans had done. Okay, now the governor had the sole right to impose capital punishment. Nobody else could do that. And so that's why we see here in Matthew, it was an old custom during the feast for the governor to pardon a single prisoner named by the crowd. He's the only guy that can kill off somebody, so he's the only guy that can also pardon them. So the governor would control everything. He was the Supreme Court, but you could appeal a governor's decision. And if you appealed a governor's decision, then you had to go to Rome. And so we see that play out also in Acts 25. Paul answered, I'm standing at this moment before Caesar's bar of justice, where I have a perfect right to stand, and I'm going to keep standing here. I've done nothing wrong to the Jews, and you know it as well as I do. If I've committed a crime and deserve death, name the day, I can face it. But if there's nothing to their accusations, and you know there isn't, nobody can force me to go along with their nonsense. We fooled around here long enough. I appeal to Caesar. Festus huddled with his advisors briefly and then gave his verdict. You've appealed to Caesar you're going to go. So that is the background of what's playing out here. Paul knows that he can appeal to Caesar, and so he uses it at this moment. Now, the final thing that the governor was responsible for was keeping the peace. Now, there's no pictures. It's hard to get pictures of Roman legionaries, but I thought this was pretty cool. This is an army of historical miniatures that somebody painted up. I thought that was kind of neat. So that's why this is here. So the rule of law was vitally important to keep the peace. Okay, the governor, the captain of the militia or whatever, like everybody was there because of the rule of law. So if people didn't obey the laws, everything crumbles. The whole empire crumbles. It was the rule of law that kept that empire going. So the governor had either legions or militia. Legions are way better than militia, but he had one or both in order to enforce the peace in his area. So he could march these people around wherever he needed to. And if the emperor or the Senate found out that there were, let's say, riots or the peace wasn't being kept or the rules, the law was not being kept within your province, then you could lose your job and get exiled, because exile is way, way worse than being killed. And so we can now, with that, see why these scriptures are written the way they are. Here in Acts 23, the captain called up 2 centurions, get 200 soldiers ready to go immediately to Caesarea, also 70 cavalry and 200 light infantry. I want them ready to march by 9 o'clock tonight, and you'll need a couple of mules for Paul and his gear. We're going to present this man safe and sound to Governor Felix. Why would they go to all this trouble for this one guy that's accused of this kind of minor thing? The answer is the same answer that we have today. Like, why would we spend so much money on armed guards and a bulletproof truck to take Karla Homolka to trial? Well, because it's due process. Like, the fact that we're following our laws, even if it costs a ton, to keep the rule of law in place is the most important thing. So we'll go to these kind of extremes in order to do that. So the concept of riots and the keeping of the peace comes up over and over again in the New Testament, especially in Acts. So in Matthew 26, we see this is when Jesus is on trial. At that very moment, the party of high priests and religious leaders was meeting in the chambers of the chief priest named Caiaphas, conspiring to seize Jesus by stealth and kill him. They agreed that it should not be done during Passover week. Why not? Because we don't want a riot on our hands. Riots are bad. Then later in Matthew 27, when Jesus really is on trial, when Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere and that a riot was imminent, he took a basin of water and washed his hands in full sight of the crowd, saying, I'm washing my hands of responsibility for this man's death. From now on, it's in your hands, your judge and jury. Pilate did not need a riot, and he did not need to lose his job. Here's another one in Acts 19. So if Demetrius and his guild of artisans have a complaint, they can take it to court and make all the accusations they want. If anything else is bothering you, bring it to the regularly scheduled town meeting and let it be settled there. There is no excuse for what's happened today. We're putting our city in serious danger. Rome, remember, does not look kindly on rioters. With that, he sent them home. Yeah, the way Rome deals with rioters is it sends in the troops and they beat everyone's heads. As they were trying to kill him, word came to the captain of the guard, a riot! The whole city's boiling over. Now, if you're a captain of the guard, these are the worst things you could ever hear in your job. Like, this is what you fear every day when you wake up, is somebody running up and saying this. A riot, the whole city's boiling over. So he acted swiftly. His soldiers and centurions ran to the scene at once. As soon as the mob saw the captain and his soldiers, they quit beating Paul. That's nice for Paul. Here in Acts 24, we found this man time and again disturbing the peace. That's bad. Stirring up riots against Jews all over the world. That's even worse. The ringleader of a seditious sect called the Nazarenes. He's a real bad apple, I must say. We caught him trying to defile our holy temple and arrested him. You'll be able to verify all these accusations when you examine him yourself. So these were the accusations against Paul and why he was chained up for these kinds of things, for being a peace disturber. Okay, so let's talk about crucifixions. Now, crucifixion was the most painful and humiliating death imaginable. It was so terrible that it was not allowed to happen to citizens. It could only happen to non-citizens, basically people in the provinces and stuff. And you could have your sentence of death commuted to voluntary exile unless you were guilty of treason. Treason was the worst possible thing you could do against Rome. Again, that rule of law, keeping the peace. So if you did something pretty bad, like murder or whatever, then you would be sentenced to death, and you're like, I'll take exile instead. And then you would go and live off in the provinces or whatever and never show your face again in Roman territory. Unless it was treason, in which case there's no helping you. Now, this is Spartacus. This is actually a shot from the TV show Spartacus, which is totally not worth watching. Now, there were 3 servile wars that happened, servile meaning slaves. The first was in 135 to 132 BC, so basically 100 years before Christ. The second was 100 BC, took place in Sicily. The first one took place in Sicily. The second one took place in Sicily. The third one was in about 70 BC, 73 to 71, and it was in Italy, and it was led by Spartacus. Okay, so you probably heard of Spartacus. Now, Spartacus and 70 gladiators basically rebelled. They ran away, and when the local militia was sent to defeat them, the 70 gladiators were easily dispatched, the Roman militia that was sent after them. And so they were running around in the hill country in Italy and getting more and more supporters, to the point where 2 years later, Spartacus had 120,000 men, women, and children following along with him. So he was a real flashpoint for all the, ill will and upsetness from all the slaves and all the poor and everybody that just didn't like the way Rome was being run. He became their new leader. So he grew to a really huge number. And when Rome sent the militia and even their trained legions against him, he beat them. So he was making Rome look terrible. And at the same time that this rebellion was happening in Italy, the Roman legions were on the forefront of the empire, like in Greece. They had just recently revolted, so Rome was there kind of stomping down this Greek revolt. And then they were also fighting in Crete and Armenia, trying to add more territory to the empire. And it just reminds me of this line that I always thought was great in Braveheart, where this is Richard the Longshanks, King of England, and William Wallace has started a little rebellion that's going up in Scotland. And he says to one of the people of his court, he says, "How will the French respect us if we cannot control the whole of our island?" This is what is going on. If Spartacus is running around with 120,000 people in the middle of Italy, why should the Armenians or the Cretians not fight against Rome? Why would they surrender and just put up with being added to the empire? So this was a huge political problem. Now, it was solved by 2 very famous guys, Crassus and Pompey. So I had talked a little briefly about Pompey the Great, what a great general he was. They defeated Spartacus in 71 BC. Now, because all these people were not citizens and they were convicted of treason, they crucified 6,000 of the survivors and lined the roads with them. And that's why they were crucified. So crucifixion was really reserved for treason. So this starts to make a lot of sense when we look at the trial of Christ before Pilate. And they began accusing him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar." That's pretty serious, withholding taxes from Caesar. and saying that he himself is Christ, a king. What? Somebody's declaring themselves king in a Roman province? And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and his crowds, "I find no guilt in this man." But they were urgent in saying, "He stirs up trouble, teaching throughout all Judea and Galilee, even to this place." Now, when Pilate heard that he asked whether the man was really a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod. So Herod was this client king that was responsible for Galilee. And so Pilate, as governor, is like, "Oh, great, I'll just send you down to this little guy and he can take care of it." And so Pilate sent him over to Herod, who happened to be in Jerusalem at that time. And so that's why that is happening with Christ's trial. That's why he's being shuffled around everywhere, because they're trying to respect the jurisdictions and who's in charge. And this bizarre accusation of being an insurrectionist. Okay? So Jesus was crucified for these two reasons. First, Jesus wasn't a citizen of Rome. He could be crucified. The second thing is for treason. He was hung on the tree for treason. And you can see that in the charge on the sign that was posted on the cross. And it says, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." Okay? This is a guy who's trying to claim himself to be a king. And the two guys that were hung next to Jesus were not thieves. That was a lousy translation of King James Version back in the day. They too were insurrectionists. They were trying to start a little revolt. Judea was always revolting. They were a big pain in the side for Rome. And so these guys had started a little revolt. And that's why they were hanging there, because they weren't citizens and they were there for treason as well. Now, the really funny or ironic thing about this is that what they accused Jesus of actually was true. He really was a subversive agent who was looking to take back his kingdom. Now, it's kingdom in a different sense from the way the Romans viewed it, but Jesus was a king that was trying to get his kingdom back, kind of like Tarquinius. And so, in the end, he did end up winning. He got a kingdom, and Rome fell. Now, this whole governorship thing is interesting when you look at this parable that Jesus told. He said, "Good servant, great work. Because you've been trustworthy in a small job, I'm making you governor of 10 towns. So governors are like the final authority over an area. So this is a picture of heaven where we, as his followers, will be given final authority over something. There's another hint at it here, Paul writing in Corinthians. He says, "Do you not know that we are to judge angels? How much more than matters pertaining to this life?" Again, hinting at some kind of governorship, some authority that we're going to have in the afterlife. Okay, so that's government. Now let's move on to adoption. Now, the Jews didn't have any concept of adoption. When a man died, his brother became head of his household, making legal decisions. It was also under the Mosaic law, women could inherit property and rights. You see that was one of the first cases that was brought before Moses. So the Jews just didn't care about adoption. There was no reason for them to have that. In Rome, it was quite common, especially in the upper senatorial class. So in order to be a senator level, you had to have a ton of money, like $1 million in your bank account to even be considered at that level. So here's a few names that you may have heard of: Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Nero, Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, and Lucius Verus. All of those were adopted. Now, senators came from this rich nobility, and they had to have sons in order to continue the line. They could pass on their wealth, their lands, and title to their son. The problem was that it was really expensive to have a family at this level, because you had to have, the reality TV show, you had to have the sports car, you had to have the CEO job for each child. And that just gets crazy expensive to sustain that kind of lifestyle. So the rich families usually were very small families, and they would sometimes not have any boys. Then you would have other families that were like, oh man, I'm stuck with these 4 sons. This is just too bloody expensive to, continue having this lavish lifestyle for each one of them so that they maintain this rank, senatorial rank. And so they were looking to get rid of extra sons. And that's why you see all this adoption. So the father of the family had to be a Roman citizen, and he got to decide who was up for adoption. And a citizen could recognize their natural born children, even if it was not from their wife. Okay, so a Roman citizen could have a child with, I don't know, someone, a prostitute, a mistress, whatever, and then say, I'm going to recognize that child and bring them in. They have full rights and privileges of a son. Other cultures didn't allow that kind of stuff, but Rome allowed it. If that child was a slave, because the mother was a slave, then the Roman could then free them, and then they could adopt them in. If they were already free, then they just adopted them in. Now, if a plebe, that's the lowest caste, they were free people, but the lowest caste in Roman society. If they were adopted by a patrician, which is the highest level, kind of nobility, they would instantly become a patrician. Right? You lost your old rank. A sum of money was exchanged for the adoption. And I guess the thing to make really clear here is the adopted person was a full-grown adult. They were like 20s, sometimes even in their 30s when they were adopted by these other families. Basically, you were proven healthy and good and mature when you were adopted in. So now another thing that's funny about this adoption stuff is that a child that is born biologically could be disowned by the father and kicked out of the family completely, but not an adopted child. Once a child was adopted, it was permanent. There's nothing you could do in order to break it or get rid of it. And now the Romans were pretty fast and loose with this adoption. Like I said, it was pretty common at the upper class. But you could adopt someone even when you were dead. So you could do that in your will. And you could just say in your will, oh, by the way, I adopt this person and they are now inheriting all this stuff. And then your living sons would be like, what? What's going on here? The second thing is you could adopt someone older than you. And so there's cases where a particular patrician was not able to get a position within the Senate for some kind of reason because his family wasn't high enough. So a younger guy who was trying to raise his stakes would then adopt the older guy. He would now join his family, and then he would suddenly be eligible for that particular position. So it was like crazy stuff that was going on with this adoption stuff. Now, the most famous is with Julius Caesar. So, as I said, he was this dictator for life. They were so upset and concerned about Julius Caesar and the way he was behaving that they decided, we need to kill this guy. And they actually had no plan of what to do next after they killed him. They were just so focused on getting rid of him. So they killed him. And then while they were trying to figure out like who's going to lead, how are we going to run the republic now? In his will, Julius Caesar adopted this guy that was kind of relatively obscure called Octavius, and made him Gaius Julius Caesar Octavius. And he was 18 at the time. And this sort of created a precedence for future Caesars or emperors, where they would choose someone not necessarily of their family to take over for them as emperor. So there's a lot of emperorship that changes this way, not by hereditary. So, for instance, Tiberius, who's mentioned in Scripture, he was the adopted son of Augustus, in order to pass the emperorship along. So when you had a name in Rome, it had 3 parts: the praenomen, the nomen, and the cognomen. Now you may notice the font that I chose here is Times New Roman. I like some good font humor, so I figured that was appropriate. Okay, so you have that's your name. You have those 3 parts. So the praenomen is your given name. So in my case, that would be Thomas. The nomen is your clan or family name. And so in my case, that would be Henschel. And then the cognomen is kind of like a nickname, just something like that. So for me, that might be Mr. Awesome. Now, if actually nobody's ever called me Mr. Awesome, which is kind of disappointing. Now, if you were to be adopted by someone, so Gaius Octavius Thurinius, if he's adopted, the way the naming would go is he would become Gaius Julius Caesar as his nomen, and then he would take his old family name and put that as the cognomen, so Octavianus. Okay, so you had a new name that still had one part of your old name. When you became adopted, you totally walked away from the old life. You didn't have really the name of your old family anymore, except for that little nickname part. You walked away from your children. So any children that you had are now left behind. Any debts that you have are completely erased. You have totally switched master. You are a new person in the eyes of the Roman world. And so that starts to make a lot of sense now when we look at Luke 14. Jesus says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. So therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. Jesus is talking about that adoption type thing of totally walking away from the old life and totally all in on the new life. No going back. Here in Romans 8, obviously Paul uses a Roman concept when he's talking to the Romans. He says, for you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption as sons, irrefutable adoption, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. Here's another one he writes in Galatians. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son, born of woman, but born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God had sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. And here in Ephesians, he says, in love, he predestined us for what? For adoption to himself as sons through Christ Jesus. Now, this makes me think of, the adoption part is incredible. That's what he meant when he was writing adoption to these people at the time. But then there's this other part about this name thing, and I just wonder, when he says here in Revelation, Jesus speaking, says, are your ears awake? Listen to the wind words, the Spirit blowing through the churches. I'll give the sacred manna to every conqueror. I'll also give a clear, smooth stone inscribed with your new name, your secret new name. And I'm wondering if this is a new praenomen and nomen that Jesus will be giving to us in the next life. Okay, so now let's talk about citizenship. If any of you have experienced immigrating to Canada, like say as an adult, I had a friend who was from Taiwan, and he lived here in Canada for many, many years and just worked on his citizenship, worked on it, and he was waiting for that day when he could be a citizen, and took the tests and all this stuff. He was just really excited to get that citizenship. And so for the rest of us that have just been born here, we're just like, hey, yeah, I'm a citizen. Oh, well, whatever. But it's the people that live as non-citizens that really kind of feel that difference and know what's going on. So let's talk about citizenship. Okay, so the first thing that happened was if you were a citizen, you got to vote, okay? So all these senators that are being put into power, it ultimately comes down to a vote as to who gets those offices. So if you were a citizen, then you got to run for those offices. They even had plebs that were running for senatorial offices. That didn't mean they won, but they could run. If you were a citizen, you could join the legions, for instance. Now, later they were kind of more wishy-washy about that. But the idea being that why would you fight for Rome if you weren't even a citizen of it? So you had to be a citizen. First, later they turned it into, you could fight for Rome, therefore we'll give you a citizenship. You had contracts. You were able to have binding contracts with people if you were a citizen. If it was between non-citizens, then they didn't have to hold up their contracts. Marriage was allowed from citizen to citizen. Children were citizens, so that's why it was important to be a citizen. Now, you could sue and you could be sued, and you're like, wow, that sounds like a really great benefit. The idea being here is that you were a legal person. Like, you could exist as far as the courts were concerned. Therefore, you could sue someone. If somebody wronged you, you could sue them, and that was great. And you could be sued because you were actually a worthy person who could stand up in court and defend themselves from being sued. You were entitled to a trial, so you couldn't just go off and be killed by someone for anything, even if you had done something terrible. You had the right to an appeal. So we kind of briefly covered that with the governors, where you could appeal the governor's decision and go all the way to Rome. And finally, you could be beheaded. Now, that sounds like a really bizarre right that you get as a citizenship. But the idea here is that to be crucified or tortured or whatever, like, these were terrible things. So they had kind of a, the nice way to die, compassionate way to die was through beheading. And so if you were a citizen, you could request a beheading, and then that would be granted to you. So Peter, who wasn't a citizen, was crucified just like Christ. Paul, who was a citizen, was not crucified. He was beheaded because that was his right as a citizen. And so Rome used their citizenship as a highly valued benefit of being conquered or surrendering to Rome, right? So on the negotiating table, when the armies show up at your door and you're just like, I wonder if I should fight them or not. And they come along and say, listen, if you don't fight us, we'll let you stay and be king, and we'll make you and, your families or all your nobles, we'll make them all citizens, and they'll have all these rights and protections in the new world order that when you join the Roman Empire. And it's like, well, that sounds pretty good. But if you fight us, citizenship is off the table. You will only be a province and only considered a province, and we can do whatever we want with you. And when the Roman army's here, they could do whatever they want to you and stuff. And so this whole idea of citizenship was really important. And so it was defended, as we saw, with having due process and paying money for the proper trial. So it was defended, but it was also valuable to these other countries. And so we can see this in Acts 22. By now the captain was thoroughly exasperated, and he decided to interrogate Paul under torture in order to get to the bottom of this, to find out what he had done that provoked this outraged violence. As they spread-eagled him with thongs, getting him ready for the whip, Paul said to the centurion standing there, "Is this legal, torturing a Roman citizen without a fair trial?" When the centurion heard that, he went directly to the captain. "Do you realize what you've done? This man is a Roman citizen." The captain came back and took charge. "Is what I hear right? You're a Roman citizen?" Paul said, "I certainly am." The captain was impressed. "I paid a huge sum for my citizenship. How much did it cost you?" "Nothing," said Paul. "It cost me nothing. I was free from the day of my birth." That put a stop to the interrogation, and it put the fear of God into the captain. He had put a Roman citizen in chains and come within a whisker of putting him under torture. The result of if he had tortured Paul, he probably could have been exiled himself, like lost his job, and then possibly exiled him and his family and everything. Like, it was a terrible thing to violate this citizenship. I really wanted to say, so Paul says in Philippians here, but there's far more to life for us. We're citizens of high heaven. We're waiting the arrival of the Savior, the Master, Jesus Christ, who will transform our earthly bodies into glorious bodies like his own. He'll make us beautiful and whole with the same powerful skill by which he is putting everything as it should be under and around him. So talking to an audience, now again in Judea, that's mostly not Roman citizens, and talking about, there is a Roman citizenship and it's pretty good, but there's an even better citizenship, and that's to be a citizen of Christ's new kingdom, of God's heaven. That is really appealing. And we can see that mentioned here in James. He chose the world's down and out as kingdom's first citizens with full rights and privileges. God's going to defend his citizens. This kingdom is promised to anyone who loves God, and here you are abusing these same citizens. How dare you, is what James is saying. Then in Ephesians, and he came and preached peace to you who were far off, and peace to those who are near. For through him we both have access in one spirit to the Father. So then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and the members of the household of God. Okay, so now we finally got to the good stuff, the part that I really wanted to talk about, and that is taxes. Okay, here's how taxes would go in the Roman Empire. Taxes were not based on what you earned, based on what you owned. So whatever you had, when the tax man came along, you paid 1% of your owned wealth. So obviously you don't want him coming along very often. And owned wealth was categorized as land, homes, slaves, animals, personal items, and any money that you happen to have. There was even like special taxes. So Vespasian imposed a fiscus judacis, which is a tax on Jews. And he instituted this because of the first revolt. So many of you know how the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. They destroyed it as part of this first revolt from 66 to 73 AD. And the Rome was so upset about having to go down there and destroy the temple and kill everybody that Vespasian put in this tax for all Jews, not just the ones in Judea, but all Jews anywhere in the empire had to pay this special tax. And the tax was set to be the same as the temple tax, which Moses had put in, which was the half shekel. And so the really horrible thing for the Jews, not only did they have to pay this temple tax, and they didn't have a temple, was that the money that went normally to the temple went now to the Capitoline Jupiter temple, which is what you see pictured right here. So it was going to this Jupiter temple, and that was really horrible. So even with these terrible taxes, or what I would call dumb taxes, Paul still writes in Romans, pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. So that is really a different way of living, given that you have these almost crazy levels of taxation going on within Rome. Now let's talk about tax farming. And sometimes you hear it called publicans, publicani. So the way taxes worked in Rome was they had a region, say the province of Syria, and then they would say, okay, in this province of Syria, we expect to get kind of this much in taxes. Let's say, we were going to tax St. Joseph Island in this tax farming way. We say, okay, St. Joseph Island, we expect to get about $100,000 in tax revenue. So what they would do is they would auction that out to the highest bidder. So maybe one person would say, oh, well, I'll bid, $100,000 for it, hoping that they're going to get more than that. Another person would say, oh, I'll bid $120,000 or whatever. Rome simply picked the highest bidder. Once that person got it, then they were empowered by Rome to go and collect the taxes. So they would say bid $150,000 for taxes. They would pay the $150,000 to Rome. Now Rome doesn't care what happens anymore. And so they would then go and collect as much as they could in order to not just cover their $150,000, but to make something on top of that. Maybe $250,000 is what they try to collect. So they would be really thorough about getting all the money from everybody. So you can imagine that people, first of all, didn't like you because these Roman conquerors came in, and now you've sold your soul to them, and now you're trying to get money out of me in order to pay for what you paid them for taxes. But it also opened up to a lot of corruption and scheming. People would collect way more taxes than technically they should have because they were just trying to make a return back on their investment for the tax farming. These tax collectors would collude with the local magistrates or farmers to buy large quantities of grain at low prices, and then when things were running thin, then they would sell them at really high prices. And only these people that had collected all these taxes had that kind of money lying around in order to do that. And so people obviously hated them for that. They would also be money lenders. So you see that mentioned in scripture where it's like the tax collectors and the money lenders. Sometimes the same people or similar families, people working together, they would lend out the money at 4% per month. So that starts to really add up. That's kind of almost mafia rates. Well, sort of. And then they would make exemptions to their friends and family members. So they bid all this money, and then they go, oh, I really like you. You don't have to pay any taxes. And then that makes those of us who do pay taxes feel really shabby. Now, in the end, Augustus got rid of this practice in the main areas like Italy and whatever. But it was still going on in Syria, and Israel was a part of that. So that's why you see it coming up in Scripture. By 167, the Republic was so enriched through conquest and the mines in Spain that they really didn't do this tax farming thing anymore. They did a levied tax, the kind of taxes we're more familiar with. So all of this tax farming thing, you can see how in Luke 15, it says, now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to him, meaning Jesus. And the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. This is like, he should know what a terrible people he's hanging out with. And then Jesus says, what do you think? A man had 2 sons, and he went to the first and said, son, go and work in the vineyard today. And he answered, I will not. But afterward he changed his mind and he went to the other son and said to the same. And he answered, I go, sir, but did not go. Which of the 2 did the will of his father? And they said, the first. Jesus said to them, truly I say to you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes go into the kingdom of God before you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But the tax collectors and the prostitutes believed him. And even when you saw it, you did not afterward change your minds and believe him. So Jesus would use the example of these terrible tax collectors. Okay. So these are some coins, common coins from the Roman Empire. The most important one is kind of the top middle, the denarius. And the original word mint is for the manufacture of a silver coin in Rome in 268 BC. And they started making the first silver coins in the temple of Juno Moneta. And the goddess became the personification of money. Moneta became money. And that's why we use that term today. So the denarius was the backbone of the economy. And it's kind of like the $20 bill, right? Everything, you just kind of get a bunch of them together and you can pretty much buy anything that you would normally need. And so to just give you an idea of what a denarius is worth, for a while it was 1 to 3 days of pay for the legionary. A farm laborer, daily farm labor would be 25 denarii. A bushel of about a week's supply of wheat was 100. Barley was 60. Wine, 1.5 pints, would be 30 denarii. Oil is 40. Salt is 100. Now, 1 pound of purple dyed silk was worth 150,000 denarii. That's crazy expensive. Now, to be an equestrian, you had to have a personal wealth of at least 400,000 denarii. And to be a senatorial class, you had to have 1,000,000 denarii. So the people in Rome who really would consider themselves rich had fortunes of over 100 million denarii. So if you were to show up somewhere wearing purple, that was the equivalent of showing up to work in this thing. I like to throw in these car pictures for Joe Hodden because it helps keep him interested in the messages. So that was a really big deal to wear purple. Now, I want to focus in on these coins in particular. So there's a denarius and then the antidenarius. The coins were basically used as propaganda. One way in which people found out they even had a new emperor was not through the news system. It was by the coins. They would be like a new face on your coin. You go, oh, look at that. There's a new emperor. And even all emperors always minted their own coins, even the really short-lived ones. So it's like within the first week of getting the job as emperor, you were start pumping out coins because they wanted to ensure their face got on it. The coin was viewed as embodying the attributes of the individual portrayed on it. So if it had the face of, I don't know, the goddess of luck, then it was, be like considered a lucky coin and stuff. So they would always have something else on the other side of the coin beside the emperor's face, whether it would be an eagle or something else. Now, when they had these coins, they started off with a high degree of silver in them. But over the years, they got less and less value in them. And so the coins basically lost value because there wasn't as much specie or silver inside them. But it was the stamp of the emperor. It was his face, his image on the coin that made it kind of hold its value. Purity wasn't what was important. It was the image impressed on it that was important. And so if we go and we look at Luke 20, where the scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him, that's Jesus, at that very hour, for they perceived that he had told this parable against them, but they feared the people. So they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be sincere, that they might catch him in something he said. so as to deliver him up to the authority and jurisdiction of who? The governor, who could kill him off for them. So they asked him, "Teacher," meaning Jesus, "we know that you speak and teach rightly and show no partiality, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not?" That's a really good question. But he perceived their craftiness and said to them, "Show me a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription does it have?" They said, "Caesar's." And he said to them, "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were not able in the presence of the people to catch him in what he had said, but marveling at his answer, they became silent. So they were trying to trick him into saying something that they could use against him and say, "Oh, look, he told us not to pay taxes to Caesar. He's an insurrectionist," or "he wants us to pay taxes to him because he's trying to make himself king," or something like that. And he didn't fall for it. But there's another thing in here that I think is easily missed and what I really wanted to share, and that is the value of the coin was in whose image was on it. And so when he says, "Give to God the things that are God's," he's talking about the image of the Creator that's on you. And I think maybe somebody needs to hear this today, that the value that you hold is because of the Creator's image imprinted on you. It doesn't matter how impure you are, you have the Creator's, the King's imprint on you. So go and give to God this week what is His. Thank you for listening. I hope it was valuable to you.